Thank you for coming to this session. The session is Climate Change, Communication, and Education. I'm the chair here, not presenting. I'm Paul Orlesky. I'm on faculty here in the College of Education. Before we start, I'll do what should be done. I'm acknowledging that we're on Treaty 6 land, the traditional homeland of the Métis. Thanks for coming. We have 3 speakers for this session. It's probably going to be about, I don't know. Well, everyone has 15 minutes, but because we're starting about 7 or 8 minutes late, I think we're going to that's going to cut into our Q&A time at the end, but that's just how it is with time here. So anyway, the first speaker is coming in from Rachel. Are you in BC right now?
I am.
Okay, so Rachel Molina Chan is going to be, well, she's there, video conferencing in from BC, somewhere in BC. And the title of her talk is Storytelling, a Tool for Exploring Climate Change Engagement in Saskatchewan. Okay, so Rachel's on now. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, can you guys see my screens okay? All right, thanks so much for having me today. I'm just going to start my timer so I can stay on track. I'm coming to you today from Victoria, BC, the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And they're known as the Songhees today. But I'm originally from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory, and I've just been living in BC for about a year now, finishing up my master's degree and doing work on this Bridging the Gap project with Climate Justice Saskatoon. So I'm kind of wearing 2 hats today. I'm going to be speaking about both of those projects and making some linkages between storytelling and climate change communication and education. So my goal today is to really zip through some theory of change here about why we're using storytelling and what we think storytelling, what role we think it can play in climate change engagement work, especially in Saskatchewan, but places like it too. So I'm going to talk through a bit of the theory, but then get right into some examples and offer 2 applications in my own work from the last year or 2 about what stories can do when we apply it to climate change engagement. So I'll be giving an example from my study, looking at communities that are aware of and concerned with climate change, and then a community-based initiative that was focused on coal-producing communities in Saskatchewan who are coming at it from a slightly different angle. And then I'll leave you with a few questions about where we could maybe take this next and hopefully get the wheels turning for that Q&A. All right, so diving in here, I'm going to be talking to you about why I'm choosing stories to look at this work. And the big piece of this is that we're not just here to, relay information. When we talk about climate change communication and education, the goal here really is about values and about changing things in line with those values. And so we're thinking about this, and what drives me to this work is my values of social and environmental justice. And so we're going beyond the information deficit model here. We're not assuming that people aren't doing enough because they don't know enough or because they don't understand well enough. But we're getting underneath the surface of that to think about what actually motivates us as individuals and what tethers us to the context in which we interpret this information. So in my project, we use Marshall Ganz's framework for narrative, thinking about stories of self, stories of us, and stories of right now. So, how do these stories create the context for our identities, for the communities that we are a part of, and of course the common story that we're all telling right now in terms of what we should do about climate change. So the storytelling is, a part of all human cultures, and we want to be thinking about how even at a linguistic level, we require connection points between the beginning and the middle and the end of something in order to interpret its meaning. And this is true whether we're talking about fact or fiction. One sec here. Oh, sorry, I lost it here, guys. Gonna zip back in. Are you guys hearing me okay? I'll slow it down a tiny bit. Okay. Pick back up here. So, we're thinking about how meaning is not just inherent. It's not natural. It's socially constructed. And interpretations aren't just cognitive. We're not talking about A plus B equals C. We're talking about how A is important and B is unavoidable and C is possible. These are subjective constructs that we can change if they're limiting the way that we engage, if they're presenting barriers. And my work focuses at the level of public narrative. because those are the stories that are dominating our societies and that give structure to the cultural aspects of climate change engagement. And too often, those narratives are privileging people who already have power. And so shifting them is a leadership practice. And this is what Gans says, is that public narrative and shaping them is a leadership practice of translating our values, values of justice, of empathy and equity into action. So he's not even talking about climate change here, but this is one of my favorite quotes from Gans. He says, "Narrative is the discursive means we use to access the values that equip us with the courage to make choices under conditions of uncertainty, to exercise our agency." So he's saying that the future is uncertain, it's unfinished, and it's up to leaders to take this moment in time and make it mean something to people so that they do something that they might not otherwise do. So diving into the examples here, I'll start by talking about my master's research, which focused on the climate change narratives of young leaders in Saskatchewan. So people aged 20 to 40 who are already convinced about climate change, they know what's happening and they understand the basic science. They're already active in their communities at some level, if not working on climate change already. And I wanted to know, how are they making sense of the story here? Especially given that in Saskatchewan, we see a lot of inaction from our provincial government and even rhetoric that suggests that climate policies are bad. So what I wanted to do was figure out the connection points between the frameworks my participants were using to understand climate change and the meaning, trying to link up knowledge and action and use narrative as a structure and a function, and to understand the function of narrative as it equips us to explain our reality, rationalize our decisions, justify our choices, and just explain and make sense of what we're perceiving. So this is building off of Gans. There's 4 parts to this narrative. It's got a challenge, characters with choices that are meaningful in determining the outcome, and of course a moral of the story. So these 4 pieces of the plot, this was the starting point for me in asking, what's the story here with young leaders in Saskatchewan? And another way to think of those 4 parts of the story is to use this mnemonic and the metaphor of a mountain. What matters? What's at stake? What do we want? What will it take? So we're thinking about, why is climate change a challenge, and what does it mean to make the choice to actually scale this type of challenge? What are our options? What do we want to achieve? What's on the other side of this challenge, and can we actually perceive that or have vision for that? And what will it take for us in terms of our actions right now? How do we make that choice embodied in the context of everyday life? And this is just a way to conceptualize different aspects of a narrative that can actually be immobilizing. So I use the terms narrative fidelity and narrative dissonance to kind of conceptualize, a story that really is leading us to action that makes sense, where the challenges, choices, outcomes, and morals are making sense and connecting to each other. And narrative dissonance to explain the experience of those pieces not adding up. So if the challenge isn't super clear, or if nobody's talking about it, or if those choices and the stakes of our choices aren't really laid out, if we don't know if it's worth it to climb, these are things that can create narrative dissonance, even among people who are knowledgeable and motivated about climate change. So this was the map that I created through my thesis to start to identify themes that was leading people to fidelity or dissonance. We talked about the sense of agency that you can feel about the challenge of climate change, and really connecting our knowledge to a story where we're characters, where we have responsibility over the choices, where that sense of responsibility is actually connected to a sense of capacity over the outcomes that are headed our way, and that the moral of the story is action, and that means something tangible because we know how action today connects to this broader vision for change. So stories shape how we exercise our agency, and they're not just in our heads, they're in our relationships, in our lesson plans, in our news headlines, and in our power dynamics. The second example kind of takes this idea and brings it into the context of communities that are not as on board, who maybe don't have that sufficient knowledge, or for whom that knowledge is not sparking a story that leads them to want to take climate action. So we were working on building relationships and capacity between an environmental organization, Climate Justice Saskatoon, and people in coal communities in Saskatchewan, focused on Estevan and Coronach. And the same sort of storytelling framework was used for this piece. This is a nice quote from George Marshall that sums it up. He says, "I find that everyone, experts and non-experts alike, converts climate change into stories that embody their own values, assumptions, and prejudices. And only if they're supplied with an even more compelling replacement story will they abandon their original version. So this is what we wanted to know. What is that original version of the story that's already being talked about in these communities to make sense of the choice to phase out coal by 2030? That was the context for our conversation. What do they think about that choice? What kind of challenges does that present for who? What kind of characters matter in their stories? What kind of values are guiding them to frame problems? What kind of choices do they perceive? What's at stake for these communities who really stand to lose their livelihoods and their incomes and a lot of their social structure if this industry is phased out? So what identities are at play and what actions are they taking? Who's got power in this story and whose choices matter? And what's the outcome that they want? What's the outcome that they want to avoid? What do they hope for and what do they fear? What kind of rationale are they using and what limits do they perceive on what's possible? And of course, we want to know the moral of the story for them. What's their interpretation of the situation and our role in it? What actions are justified? What choices do we actually have when it comes to planning for a just transition for those communities? What's the meaning of the story for them based on their values and their morals? And within that, is there any common ground for actually building solidarity between our groups and actually advocating for solutions that hit on that common ground and the values that we do actually share? So I won't get into the details of our results, but I do want to say that we returned to these communities at the end of March to host workshops outlining our findings and sharing our own stories, because we weren't unbiased researchers. We were going in as people who advocate for this type of solution, but who know that there's all kinds of implications at the social and cultural level for how we actually see this through, how we make these decisions in Saskatchewan. And so we had great turnout, especially in Coronach, where there's probably more of an existential threat with coal phase out. And we talked about employment and economic opportunities. We talked about how are we going to supply energy without coal, and how are we going to meet emissions reduction targets while we do that? What kinds of community housing and health supports are needed in these communities beyond just jobs to really make them thriving places? And of course, rural Saskatchewan is facing all kinds of challenges above and beyond climate policies. So all of those existing frameworks get woven in to be a really meaningful story. So I want to leave you with just a few thoughts about where this might go next, where it could be applied in your own work, and the questions that I have about how narrative could be useful. So just in the last minute here, I want to say, using my model to kind of think about this, of course it's important that we are conveying sufficient knowledge about climate change when we're doing communications and education initiatives. But we want to make sure that we're translating that knowledge in a way that actually sparks a mobilizing public narrative, a mobilizing story for the person or people or targets that you're talking to. We want to build a sense of agency about climate change. But we don't just want to leave people afraid or aware. We want to actually move them to action, and meaningful action. So it's important to tie in a sense of responsibility based on identities and roles that people already play. Maybe that's their role as a parent or as a professor or as a community member or as a frontline staff member or something like that. But what's their sense of responsibility given the timing that we have to make these solutions real? And how do we link that up to a real sense of capacity to actually address the climate crisis? That's going to take solidarity. That's going to take organizing and narratives that are inclusive that can actually bridge some of those gaps. And of course, those are really big abstract concepts that we have to make tangible in everyday life. If we want the moral of the story to be action, we actually need to translate that knowledge, translate a sense of agency, responsibility, and capacity into a sense of activation in the context of real life. And of course, to actually leverage power so that we're not just talking about stories, but that we're actually changing things. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rachel. That was interesting. George Marshall, I didn't know about that book. I should have. Anyway, our next speaker is Palash Sanyay. Palash, come on up. And you're speaking on having the difficult conversation, climate change is real. Thank you.
This presentation I gave last year for the university professors, staff. I was a student at that time at the university. So just to give you an idea of the kind of work I do, I've been facilitating controversial issues for almost 8 years now, from 2012. I work for an organization called SOLIA, S-O-L-I-Y-A. They work on mitigating the tension between Middle East students and also Western students. They bring them together. They talk about all the taboos, stereotypes, I'm a senior facilitator and a fellow for them. And currently I'm working at the University of Saskatchewan. My background includes engineering degree as well as social science degree. So just to, and I'll try to tell it in a storytelling way as Rachel was giving you. And by the way, I know Fraser, I think he right now doing the PhD in the history in the history department with Andrew Watson. But anyways, the work with climate change started in 2014 for me. This issue came a lot, but I was living in South Carolina, United States. And it's one of the deeply conservative Republican state, always voted for, and they actually overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Most of my friends voted for Trump. And those people are educated, they have good jobs, they're in the government, they're in the educational institute. And that was something fascinating, like we oftentimes think education might reduce the level of understanding of certain scientific things. But that's really not the case. And I can give many examples. For example, my home country, Bangladesh, is one example. If you look at the people who are having kids now, is the people who are less educated, less wealthy, are having 1 or 2 kids, whereas the higher educated, most of the faculties I know have 4 kids. They can afford it. So the narrative that used to have, it's actually not working in certain places and certain things. And most of my work has been practical. So coming back to climate change, that was one of the interesting things I first found is like, why is this thing like that? Why people with all the information in the world at the tip of their hand still trying to deny climate change? That was one of the questions I was asking. And at the very root of that, what I found was what we all fear. Everyone in this room, including me, anyone, we all fear change. In certain things, when change happens, we don't like to have those. And I should mention one of the things that I found, even with the most liberal people, is that they also fear change. And they don't want to get into the discussion because one of the things that I deeply disagree with is that you cannot have any conversation with those people. Leave them in the bubble. Why don't we can still go forward? Actually, we can't. And that's been proven for the last couple of years, many, many, many times. That's what I'm finding. I didn't put it in a research work because as I'm saying, most of my work is on ground. I go into communities where they have deep-rooted belief systems. Okay, so coming back to South Carolina, I started working with the community over there, farmers. I started with workers, and why the way they think. And it turns out, so for example, if it's a medium-sized firm, if someone has 10, 15 people working under him, he's educated, he has a bachelor's degree, and he hears me out, all the things I say about climate change. And then he says, okay, I understand everything. Now tell me who's gonna fund for the change. I understand I will implement many things. What happens if the workers don't have jobs anymore? And so behind their denials, there are deep-rooted beliefs. And then instead of going with my intervention, trying to teach them the science, trying to give them information, what I started doing, asking questions. Rather than going in with my own biases towards climate change, I started trying to talk to them, knowing them first. That was my first approach. The second thing I found, I'm not there to change their mind. I didn't even try to change their mind. The first thing I tried to do is make them neutral. At least you're not doing anything, let others do something. Don't stop the others. And the third thing I try to do is make them coexist. That's the biggest word I find we're missing in today's narrative. It's too diverse, too polarized, that we often forget that we are being human. We are human. We have to coexist. So just to give you an example, I was facilitating a session in TED Talks in Banff, and this was right before 2016 election in the United States. And the room is full of people from the United States. They organize, they're the elite in certain ways. They organize the TEDx throughout the United States. I asked them, who are you going to vote for? They say, yeah, a Democratic candidate. And then I asked them the next questions. How many of you have a Republican friend? No one puts their hands up. There you go, a good hand. Then the next question, how many of you have a Republican neighbor? None. So when you're living in your own bubble, you can talk about all the changes that's going to come, but it's not going to be effective. You can make all the policies, and that's where I'm by training, I'm a academic, and I read a lot about theory of change and other things, but it's not worth it until you can actually implement it in the ground with the people. People are the main component. And another thing I found, and this is something I'm trying to write about, is the deniers. When you try to define deniers, we often forget that somebody can deny something, but their actions might be already, they're contributing. So for affirming, their affirming technique, because of efficiency, because of economy, is already efficient system. It's already sustainable system. They just don't know it, even though they are denying climate change. So trying to connect those things, though, just going back, sorry, it's a little bit disorganized maybe because I didn't think about this through. So instead of going to them with my own agenda, I started asking questions. I became neutral. I tried to become unbiased. The choices we make in our daily life is biases, full of. Whether you take Colgate or Pepsodent, it's a choice, it's a bias. You have certain priorities, economically, color-wise, taste-wise, doesn't matter. It's the same for those places when you go. So rather than trying to go in with my ideas, I try to listen to them first. The second thing I try to see is like what they're doing in their daily life. What actually happening in their daily life. And there is many efficient process they're involved in, as I said, because of efficiency, economy, just because it's a good practice for them. So trying connecting those dots together, it helps. It helps a lot. It at least creates the ground to at least they can hear you. They can hear you in a way that goes in, not just they're hearing you because they have to. So that's another fact was being, and for me it was even harder because I was an outsider. I was someone coming in from outside, trying to tell something that they think was not relevant to them. So going forward, what happened in the process, I had a group of people who would listen to me and try to think how they can do those things. And the other point came out of this is that the leadership, sometimes you just need one volunteer in a community who would say, I will try this. And then if he sees some benefit coming out of it, he will be the model everyone will follow. And that happens everywhere. We'll see. When you pilot a project, if the benefit comes up, right away other beneficiaries come in. So there are some techniques. For example, solar panel. You get certain levy and also tax reduction. You also get certain other benefits for putting energy in the grid. Those kind of things, once one person found in the community, others felt interested. Not because they suddenly started believing in climate change, but because they had other reasons. So putting forward, connecting what actually matters to them, right? It's for everyone, what matters to you. Even most of I know many people who believe in climate change, who would act, but their lifestyle is not that sustainable in many, many, many ways. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Sorry, I didn't put anything on the presentation, but it was more about faculties because they themselves face a lot of difficult issues. Animal cruelty was one of the issues that came up in that discussion. Oh my God, that was a mess. And many other things happen, controversial. But I will be happy to answer any questions. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have one more speaker in this session, and it is John Curry, and John's from Toronto, Canada. Some of you may know about that place. And it's, John, you're going to be talking about methodologies as movies, narrative environmental journalism, as sweet as prose. That's lovely. Okay. John Curry.
All right. So now for something a little bit different. They really said, make it interactive. And they sent out another email, make it interactive. So please, I'm going to count on your interactivity on this one. I teach, I'm not an environmental educator, although I think I'm a transformative educator. I teach writing in a University of Toronto, Mississauga campus. And I teach in a very small writing program that gets word of mouth. Students come and they discover it. They discover that it's unique because we give students narrative to write. Is the first thing they write, not academic prose. They write narrative, they write memoir, they write creative nonfiction. That's the first thing they do. And that course is called expressive writing. And I see transformation. I see people coming in and learning to care about writing because they care about their own story. How could you not? And they have never encountered nonfiction writing, and so they come. I also teach, the course I'm going to talk about today is my research-based course, which is called Writing About Environment and Ecology. And the other thing we do at the program, the small program, is we publish the students' work. That's our course text. I have publishers knocking on my door. Check this out, John. Check that. Go away. Students don't want to pay you. We don't want to pay you. I spend my summers with students, and we put books together, and that's the course text. And so we publish the best of the best student work and centralize it. I also spend my time. I know I'm making myself sound great here, but what doesn't happen in the rest of the university, when people come to me and they say, you're the only prof that knows my name after 5 years in this place. But it's because we spend time one-on-one. I do two jobs. I teach in the classroom and I meet with them, and I spend my days in one-on-one conferences with students. My course includes science and non-science students of various levels. And in it, they select environment or climate change topic. I'm here because I want to shift the focus of the course more to climate change topics, but traditionally I've done a bit of both. And they write me 6 journalistic articles, each based on academic literature. So that's what they pull from. And the students become their experts. I say, don't want you to think of me as a teacher, but as your editor, but you're the expert. So I don't teach the content, they become the experts, but this is a shift for them. The shift is that they must master the task of becoming the science writer, working with academic material that's stiff, turgid, and I try to imbue with them. I say the science writer is who you are. You are becoming an educator in my course. You are looking at the world with wonder, curiosity, skepticism, but humility. And this message is crucial. So they're bridgers of the culture, of the science culture with us, the broader readership. Educated, curious, people who want to know more about something they may not have thought they wanted to know more about. They learn to write by reading student writing and talking about what makes it work. So what I want to do is do some of that with you right now. I'm going to ask you, so I'll read it and just tell me, what are some techniques in the writing you can spot? What do you like about the writing? It's from Cracking the Code Between Cleaner Shrimp and Their Clients by Serah Lewis. She was just in my past term. Thin, transparent antennae stretch out almost comically from a minuscule head. Translucent and violent speckled, the shrimp's next client approaches. A much larger reef fish that slowly swims toward the shrimp, then holds still. The shrimp weaves its antennae in a hopeful greeting. The fish darkens in response, rapidly turning from turquoise to a mossy green. The shrimp lunges at the fish's gills, its spidery antenna outstretched, and feasts on dead skin. Okay. Yes. You want to say more about that? Good, good. Yes?
Using personification to develop a relationship with the shrimp, successful.
Say what you will about the humans, but we love personifications, right? It is a technique. How is it descriptive?
It's descriptive in a way like if you were reading fiction
Right.
as opposed to reading a textbook.
And that's what I tell my students. We're using the tools and techniques of narrative and storytelling and fiction in journalism. That's exactly what we're doing. Yes?
I love that there's tension in it. Yeah.
There is tension in a good story.
Because you could have just, said that the shrimp eats dead skin off the fish.
So very visual, very visual. A story, tension, nature's oddities, and the shrimp as characters. What's your character, I say to them. Maybe your character's a number. Maybe your character's, in this case, it's a fish or two fish. Let's also do something rhetorical and note the verbs. I teach nuts and bolts to my students. I teach what is a sentence. I teach love the sentence. I teach note that writers know about verbs. How many verbs do we have there? We have verbs or phrasal verbs, verbs with something with it. We have 9 verbs there in 5 sentences, almost all of them active. So I really push that, and none of them are the verb to be. We call it the dead verb, the lifeless verb, was, is, that kind of thing. So let's go on here. Cleaner shrimp offer their services to reef fish. They consume the dead skin and parasites on the gills, scales, and mouths of their clients. The partnership benefits both parties. The fish get a cleaning and the shrimp get a meal. But how does the fish recognize friend from food? Eleanor Caves, a researcher at Duke University, decided to investigate. In 2018, Caves and her colleagues examined the signaling system between the cleaner shrimp, I don't want to say that, and its client fish. Am I on the next one here? In Curaçao, a Caribbean island. The researchers set up GoPro cameras at 10 cleaning stations, areas of the coral reef frequently inhabited by cleaner fish, and recorded footage of cleaner shrimp at work. Can we add to our list of tools, techniques that the writer is using? She had a nice question in there. That was very important. So we have our hook, and we have our question. Good. Who's our character now? I should put it back here. Dedicated with her own paragraph, we introduce the researcher right after the question, presenting them as a detective, right? More tension, more suspense. This is good writing. This didn't happen. It happened through revision. It happened by putting, doing it again and again and again. A play on words. Friend from food. Great. Wish I thought of it myself. For virtues, I'm going to give you of good storytelling. One, of course, visual storytelling. Tell my students, start in the middle of some drama, some tension underway, and with a character. The character can be a bunch of things. Students want to have a big, long, they're trained to write with big, long preambles and big, long introductions, and we do that when we're feeling insecure, as the writers are, and they're warming themselves up. So, fine, do your introduction, but we shall scalpel that after and get rid of it, because we want to get to, that piece was for you, we're making it into a piece for everyone, for the reader, and after you've warmed yourself up, give us something that we can chew on. Verb-driven detail. I talk verbs nonstop to my students. And the voice is more akin to listening to a storyteller, a children's storyteller, or a documentary storyteller. The voice is very, very important. I say your voice, you're sounding an awful lot like a teacher in your voice. This is sounding a little bit textbooky. Oh yeah, you're right, it is. Yeah, it is. This comes out naturally, and I have to pull it away from them. And I do that with examples. The second one, strong sentence craft. I really work on sentences, subject, verb, object sentences again, and again, and the beauty and simplicity of those, and how academic writing differs because, for so many reasons, but mainly there's no market for it other than itself. Avoiding passive voice, and there's another tool I hope to show you that I also use. Elegant exposition, using exposition to deliver facts and allow a kind of space to operate in the text so the reader moves into it. We'll give that a name, call it psychic space. There are smaller techniques, moving from the general to specific, or large issue to the specific, or you can do it in reverse, start from the specific and then go to the larger issue. But also to keep your opinion out of it and just present the science as science and let the science astound you. And lastly, humility. Right, with humility, avoid what I'm going to call the voice of God in your writing, or the voice of the knower. And so I'll get a sentence like this. It'll say, urbanization is thought to be the cause of extinction in most species. Or, it is therefore suggested that edible insects will be our new source of protein. Well, the writer of the article never said these things. However, it's showing up in the writing. So you need to cite your writing. That's how I say you need to cite your writing. Don't be the knower, be the person who wants to know more, and that's the humility I'm talking about, as opposed to, I know this. It comes out without even thinking about it. Another thing that comes out is lab coat diction. Again, a lot of science students, they're not even aware of bringing in the vernacular of the science into their own writing, and it's characterized by jargon and detachment, and I pointed out to them, and we work really hard on kind of stripping that away. So sentences like this: anthropogenic influence on several environmental conditions as well as diseases that affect organisms have caused dwindling numbers. They're clearly trying to impress me, and I teach them that you're doing the exact opposite. Okay, so I'll just leave you with one more little bit of narrative. So this is the methodology so she's reporting on a methodology. Oops, I'm missing the beginning here. There we are. Winchell's team captured crested anoles by tying nooses to wooden posts. The group scattered these posts around each study site, hoping that a curious crested anole would stumble upon a noose. They returned to their capturing sites at the end of each day and collected the lizards caught in the traps. They brought these lizards back to the lab and measured the lizard's limb length and digitally scanned the lizard's toe pad scans to count the number of subdigital lamellae on each toe. Also referred to as toe pads, the subdigital lamellae are raised scales on the lizard's toes that divide into individual pads. These raised scales help many lizard species to grip smooth surfaces. There's a verb count, and this is one technique I call overlapping linkages. When you're introducing terms, introduce that term at the end of a sentence and then reintroduce it and explain it as as I do here. The repetition of the term creates a zone of psychic understanding, full stop. A psychic zone of understanding occurs when the repetition helps the reader begin to feel that they now understand the term. Thank you.
Okay, so that was great. All the presentations were great. Hey, Rachel, you're still with us. Way to go. We've got 12 minutes now for Q&A. I see we've got a couple of mics there, so if you have any questions, maybe go to those mics, right? That's what the technical people want? Yeah, okay, so all questions got to line up there. And yeah, great. And try not to race and bump into each other as you're going to the mics. Good, thanks.
My question is for John. I've taught for the past number of years in a high school program that integrates various subject matter, including science and English. And so very exciting to hear the work that you're doing. And I'm just wondering if you could recommend some of your favorite authors that use that style of writing in ecology for samples that would be appropriate for a high school student.
My students' writing.
Do you?
I mean, I read Elizabeth Colbert. I read all the good stuff, and I bring some of that stuff in, you know. But when they see, oh, they've sat in my seats. They've had to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And of course, as I say, it's not for everybody. I spend my summers doing that, but I feel great. And I'll work with a team of students, and we'll have a book at the end of it, and they'll feel great. And I'll get a couple years out of it. Then everything changes, and you have to do more of it. But yeah, it's all good.
So can we find those publications somewhere?
I don't have a current one, so I don't want to give you something. I bring good, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star stuff in as well. Yeah, and
Awesome.
we work with that. But
Thanks.
I can try to think of some more for you.
Okay.
Question for John as well. Now, I didn't know about this writing style, and it's great. I have an engineering degree, and it was pretty dry, a lot of that. So I appreciate what you're doing. I remember reading a novel by Farley Mowat years ago about the big blue whale. Are you familiar? He seemed to do something similar, like it was a little bit sciencey, what the whales are doing, but he was writing it in a kind of with poetic prose. Would you consider him at all in this kind of league that you're Farley Mowat in this kind of league of writing, or maybe not? It was the only example I could think of, actually.
I think there's more contemporary. I mean, he's great. I reread the Wolf one not too long ago,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't use it for this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I forget everyone's names. For the first two speakers, I'm wondering if either of you might be able to elaborate a little bit more. I mean, obviously becoming a facilitator of difficult conversations or facilitating storytelling between different communities around climate change it's a skill and it's practice that takes a long time, but I'm wondering if you might be able to share with us some of the techniques or approaches or ways that you prepare yourself for facilitating or enabling those types of conversations or communications.
Rachel, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks for your question. You can hear me here? I appreciate where your question is coming from, because it certainly is, it takes a lot of care and intent, I think, to go into this kind of work. For my thesis, I really was excited to talk to people who were on side, who I thought I had a lot in common with. And it was a stretch to be like, okay, let's go talk to some coal producers and really have the awkward conversation. And what we found between the workshops we did was that it helped, I think. The choices we made that I think what I would recommend were that we started actually the session with our own stories. So each of us as researchers gave our own reasons for being there and the way that climate change was motivating our own perspective, but really rooted it in our personal lives, in our decisions whether or not to have kids, our decision about what job to take on, where to live, really rooting it in context for ourselves as individuals made it harder to sort of just see us as like a government representative or something. They were pleased to hear we weren't government representatives, but we also had to give them space to vent. And it wasn't really surprising after a while to see that like having a bit of space to giving people some space to really talk through what they don't want to happen, what they don't like, what they are angry about. We had to leave space for that in order to get at the more constructive stuff under the surface, and it became less scary as we went to leave that space.
Okay. So about resources, first of all, I think what John and Rachel is doing is pretty awesome. We face that a lot, also as a facilitator. If you call a watershed, farmers don't talk to you. You have to call it a slough. Yep. I mean, I faced that, and that's why you have to ask what they call it first, rather than saying, "Oh, this is a watershed." Just to give an example. About resources on facilitation, I think a couple of places you can look at. International Association of Facilitators, IAF, is pretty big. ICF, International Coaching Federation, you can look at that. IA2P, International Association of Public Participation. So all this equip you not specifically on climate change, but this actually equip you to have good facilitation skill. And also to talk. There is also International Association of Impact Assessment. They do a lot of facilitation, public participation. And the most important thing is experience, I think. If you don't throw yourself, and it's to be honest, it's frustrating in that profession in a lot of the times, because you have to deal with a lot of negativity throughout, but somebody has to do it. Somebody has to go through the dirt. And this is something we have talked among ourselves, the people who work in this realm. Practice, we actually share methods within us. There are different techniques, but on top of it, the facilitation techniques for all is the same. Asking good questions, being neutral, unbiased, using SWOT, some of the methods that we use every day. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Rachel. Can you give us an example? You showed us that diagram of several boxes flowing through a change process. Can you give us an example of how you use wow, I'm losing the word. When you have two groups that like each other. So there was, one of the obstacles was about solidarity. Can you give us an example of how your work, you've used solidarity with a reluctant group?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think the work with coal communities is the best example I could give, that like there are people in those communities that came out to our workshops who aren't interested in working with us, who are really there just to tell us that they disagree with our approach. And it was helpful to learn from them what aspects of what we were saying was really not working for them. So we were able to deepen our own understanding of carbon capture and storage, of the limitations of renewable energy, of the timeline seeming, you know, a little extreme to them. When you take climate change out of the picture, the timeline seems pretty extreme. So it was important for us actually not to go in unbiased in our experience, but to be very clear about our biases, that we think that it's inappropriate to not address climate change. That's our bias. And so we thought that that was a good starting point to at least have the conversation. And what we found was that there are people in that community that aren't entirely convinced about this alternative narrative that we don't need to phase out coal. They're kind of seeing the writing on the wall, and they're interested in working with people who are ready to advocate for solutions, because they're not really seeing that from the government right now. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to build solidarity between groups that disagree, if you can get under the surface and actually figure out what you do agree on, and not just gloss over that stuff that you disagree on, because that stuff's really important to the reason why we went down there, and we were able to make that more clear for them too.
Hi, I have a question for the first two presenters as well. Just when you are facilitating conversations, or when you're having conversations with people about future and sustainability, especially in Saskatchewan, I do find that there's a tendency for it to relatively degenerate if you have like a person that you're talking to, or even one person in your group who cares about climate change. And not like the presenters, the person in the group, and then it becomes this it degenerates really quickly. Do you have any sort of suggestions on how to pull that back and make that sort of a positive discussion, or how to interject, or any sort of tips on how to make that constructive instead of, so where you can find out the problems and where you can talk about the problems a little bit easier instead of having it just be, sort of a personal battle between a couple of people in the town.
One thing we did just at a facilitation level was I introduced the session and the goal of why we were all there. I flagged that it was awkward, that we were recognizing inherent tension in the room. So the one tool that we used was called the parking lot. And it was just a piece of paper on the wall that said parking lot. And I just told everyone that if I felt that the conversation was veering off course, I was going to park the conversation. And I never actually ended up using it in either of our workshops, but it was really helpful and it was a good cue for the room that we could anticipate that tension might arise, but that we had a plan that everyone kind of knew about, and they knew that I was in charge, essentially, to make that call and to say, if this is getting too extreme, or if there's two people that are kind of going back and forth, let's park this. Have that conversation after. Have that conversation in another room. Let's email about your concerns. Let's get more information on the table if we can't agree on what the terms of reference are. But it allowed us a tool to just veer off the conversation if it needed to be dealt with.
I have to agree with what Rachel said, and I think a couple of other things. So this came up a lot of times. Like the whole conversation then is dominated by that one person, and it's not only in climate change; it's in any conversation that happens. So one of the first thing I try to do is limit time. You cannot talk once you're putting your hands up. Only 2 minutes. If I find that kind of scenarios arise. The second thing is you have to be neutral. I think the role of facilitator have to understand you're not there to teach. You're just facilitating a conversation. You're not there to promote anything also. So being aware of yourself, I think that's the second thing I try to do. Third thing, if I see still after that there's a dominant voice in the room, I then have a conversation with the other group, not with the person, because I don't want to intimidate that person to stop talking. I talk with the other person. Are you being intimidated? What can I do to make your experience better? So I try to see if we can do things the other way around. Usually it's like you take the participant who is dominant on the side and then try to talk and see whether he or she can cool down a little bit. And also most of the facilitators I find are in favor of, they don't deny climate change. They agree climate change is happening. It's just keeping that bias aside, looking at what role you're playing here, right? Because you believe, and you're not trying to change the people already are on your side. You're trying to change those that also matters most in many cases. So those are some of the things we try to do. There are many other techniques used. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so it's 3 o'clock now, so I'd like to thank Rachel Palash.
Yes.
Sorry.
No worries.
And John Curry, too. So thank you, everybody.